Welcome to JW3 Online. We're so glad that you've tuned in, and if you don't know who we are, JW3 are a one-of-a-kind Jewish community centre in London that's open to everyone. If you want to know more about us, like us on Facebook or YouTube, and check out the rest of our events online. We hope you enjoy the programme. Hi everyone, and welcome to Young JW3's latest series, Denomination, with me, Joe Hyman, and our final guest this week, Avi Garson. We are a denomination, a nation of denominations, made up of Jews of all different types and stripes, and this is something to be celebrated. This series is here to take the stereotypes you may have about other communities in the Jewish world and throw them out the window. We're here to learn about different types of Jews and learn more about communities different to our own, because we believe that unity comes from knowing each other and celebrating both where we are similar and where we're different. Each week we'll hear from an emerging Jewish leader and learn about their denomination and community and what matters to them. If you've missed previous episodes, check out our YouTube and Facebook channel. You can catch up there. But for now, it's time to chat to Avi. Welcome, Avi. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Joe. Thank you so much for having me.
Good to see you. Before I jump into kind of the full, discussion about denominations and communities, tell us kind of, for the purposes of this program, what denomination or community you'll be talking about with us today.
So I am Sephardi from a Gibraltarian and Moroccan background, and I'm part of a Gibraltarian community based in northwest London. And I'm going to try to present all Sephardim, although that's a big ask. But my parents are from the members of Holland Park Synagogue, formed from Istanbul and Salonika. But I think from the outset, though, before we jump into it, I think it's important to clarify and establish that, strictly speaking, Sephardi is neither a denomination nor denominational. So you could say I'm quite fortunate to be on this program in the first place, and denomination. But thank you for having me. Yeah.
Thank you for being here. I'm glad that you brought that up, because it is complicated when we try to kind of put communities in particular boxes and particular kind of names and titles. It gets confusing, and who's missed out, and kind of which communities don't fit into that framework. It's important to talk about, and I think you're right in also mentioning that Sephardi culture and Mizrahi culture as well is incredibly varied and diverse. And we'll be talking about a little bit of that today, but not all of it. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Kind of, how did you come to get involved in Jewish teaching, Jewish learning, and kind of the community that you're part of?
Sure. Yeah. I might be the odd one out, because I think, unlike your other guests, they were rabbis and I'm not. But I thought I'll share with you my religious journey anyway. I was born in London, but moved to Gibraltar when I was 7 years old. And I lived there until I finished my schooling. After my A-levels, I studied in Gateshead Yeshiva for 2 years, and followed by a third year in Israel. After which I returned to London and to study at university, where I've just completed my master's. So I think, notwithstanding our Sephardi identity, very often Sephardim, they go through an Ashkenazi schooling system. Which explains why a good Sephardi Jewish boy like myself ended up in Gateshead Yeshiva, which is a flagship Haredi, Ashkenazi, Lithuanian institution, for those who know. However, ever since moving back to London, I've slowly started to rediscover and reconnect with my Sephardi tradition and heritage, and started to be more involved. While I was always familiar with the Sephardi tunes, the liturgy, and cuisine, I hadn't really been too exposed to its rich history, its different schools of philosophy, and the cultural values and norms. To give one example, in the classic Sephardi world, there doesn't really exist this dichotomy and tension, at least not to the same degree as there seems to be in other denominations or in the non-Sephardi world, between the religious and the secular. Torah and science, on the other hand, modernity and tradition. Like both sides evolve together and must be seen as natural partners. And the reason Sephardi believe so is because I think at the core of the belief is that the author of the world and the author of the Torah are one and the same, and there cannot be a contradiction. I think for this reason, historically, the greatest Sephardi rabbis managed to navigate both worlds just fine. They studied, non-Jewish wisdom. Nearly all of them worked and were involved in the real world. How many of them were like physicians, philosophers, businessmen, economists? There just wasn't that clash. And I think it's this realization, which is what led me to the chapter of my religious journey that I'm on now. Together with a group of like-minded people, we've launched the Sephardi Chabura, which is a virtual global Bet Midrash, place of study, which is an online space dedicated to exploring the classic Sephardi tradition, which seeks to embrace the world and modernity through the lens of Torah and the great Chachamim, who are the traditional Torah scholars. So much of my free time is spent on this initiative, learning texts being sort of somewhat neglected, and discussing this with like-minded Sephardi and Ashkenazi people who are sort of, attracted to this approach. And so it's a little bit of a reawakening and, quite a paradigm shift, which I've had to start from the beginning, with the basics and the fundamentals. But it's a lifelong journey.
It's really, really interesting, and I'm glad that you brought up that kind of you're one of the non-rabbinical voices, the only non-rabbinical voice within this series. But I think it's so wonderful to hear about lay people kind of in the UK community engaging seriously and in a kind of committed way with Jewish learning, especially to re-engage with texts that may not have been, or thinkers that may not have been part of that education that maybe UK Jews have in general, that's relatively kind of Ashkenazi focused in some way. It's really interesting. I'm glad that you shared that. Up next, we have the kind of 60-second denomination challenge. And just for our viewers out there, Avi is not going to be sharing 60 seconds on every kind of Sephardi, Mizrahi culture and their history. He'll be giving a little bit of a snippet on what it looks like for him. So I'm going to give you 60 seconds and give us the best kind of way that you can describe the community from your perspective. So 60 seconds, go.
The Sephardim are not really a denomination in the typical sense of the word. They are what some would classify an ethnic group comprised of Jews originally from Spain and Portugal, as well as all non-Ashkenazi Jews who come from North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. More accurately, it is a cultural identification and religious tradition that dates back to post-temple period. Sephardi Judaism has always held a faithfulness to Jewish law. The vast majority of Sephardim tend to be traditional and comfortable in religious settings, but Sephardim are incredibly diverse, culturally, for geographical reasons, of course, but also in terms of religious observance. A typical Sephardi community will have Jews of all levels of practice. To conclude, the Sephardi approach is human-centered, pragmatic, and Sephardim traditionally are a group proud of their traditions, customs, culture, music, pronunciation, liturgy, and food.
Amazing. Incredibly impressive. I think you kind of summed up the complexity of the Sephardi Mizrahi community, and that it's a kind of so much about ethnicity and the history and the places that each kind of people came from. But about that kind of human-centered focus is really beautiful as well. You kind of mentioned this in the 60 seconds, but talk a little bit about kind of the name Sephardi and perhaps Mizrahi and where it comes from, for those who may not know the Hebrew and the kind of the sources of that, and a little bit about the history of the community in the UK in some way.
Yeah. So the word Sephardi is linked to the word Sepharad, which means Spain. And with the Sephardim, you really have to time travel back in history. There's no other way. And I'll give it a go. So it appears there were already some Jews living in Spain during Roman times, although we know very little about them. And it was really after the destruction of the Second Temple that Jews concentrated in Babylon, where they'd been exiled to, started to move across North Africa, the Maghreb, and eventually by the 8th century, more and more Jews started to settle in Al-Andalus, which is Islamic Spain. And it's important to understand that at one point, more than 90% of world Jewry were living under the sway of Islam. And that's something not everyone knows. And the Iberian Peninsula, in particular, became a hub of rabbinic creativity, philosophy, poetry, culture. And Spanish Jewry really flourished in every department. And this is why this critical period in history is often referred to or labeled the golden age of Spain. It sort of a little bit went downhill after the Inquisition and the devastating expulsion of 1492. And some of the Jews and conversos, who are sort of the Jews who were forced to convert, they eventually left Spain and came to be known as the Western Sephardim. And they went to Christian places. So they went to Italy, Amsterdam, London. They went to all over the New World, of course. And these are Spanish and Portuguese Jews. Many others, though, went to North Africa. They went across the Ottoman Empire, Middle East, and even further east than that. So, of course, there already were communities in these places, right? In Morocco, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. But they're still often called, and they consider themselves Sephardim, even if they don't come from Spain. Why? Because I think they were so influenced by the influx of Spanish refugees, their culture, and that rabbinic tradition as well. And for instance, what probably the most famous example is the impact the great philosopher and Talmudist Maimonides had. We know his influence reached as far as Yemen, right? And then there's Rav Yosef Karo, whose codification, the Shulchan Aruch, became the most central code of Jewish law among all Sephardi Jewry. And actually, I'd add Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah was to a large degree developed by Sephardi rabbis. So despite spanning, from one end of the world to the other, and such a range of traditions, that there is a significant amount of cultural and religious things that we all share in common. In terms of the British scene, which you asked about, in the Sephardi scene, I think the oldest is obviously the Spanish and Portuguese community, but there are communities from Baghdad, Turkey, India. There's the Persian and Bukharians, Adeni from the British Protectorate in Yemen, Moroccan and Egyptian Jews as well. So it's quite a varied demographic. And I think one common historical sort of misconception, which is related to that, that I've come across at least, is that often people think UK is primarily an Ashkenazi community. And what many don't know is, or are ignorant of, is the fact that the Jewish community, as we know it today, was established by Sephardim, the Spanish and Portuguese. The only reason Jews were allowed to resettle in the UK is actually thanks to a man called Menashe ben Israel, who was a Portuguese Dutch Jew in the 17th century. And he managed to persuade Oliver Cromwell to reverse the decree that had been going on since the 13th century, which was prohibiting Jews to live in Britain. So this community really thrived here. It was wealthy, an educated community with great rabbis. And it's afterwards sort of the Eastern European Jews who were escaping the pogroms and the anti-Semitism started to arrive on these shores, and more recently, the Sephardi communities that I was saying.
Really fascinating, and thinking about the UK community as a community, I'm kind of aware of that history of how it started, with Bevis Marks and kind of with Menashe, bringing kind of the Jews back into the UK, and often people don't know that, and I'm really glad that you brought that up. And I think it's clear that there are similarities that kind of thread through each different community, but within the countries that they settle, kind of they bring their own traditions. We've spoken a lot about kind of the theory, the history, the name. I'd love to kind of take this into a practical realm and talk about kind of particular practices. Each person we've spoken to each week has shared a little bit about what particular Jewish practices look like in their community. Shabbat, kashrut, food rituals, and prayer. And this may be something interesting, for you as someone who is Sephardi to share about. In addition to the practice, kind of the legal, Jewish law practice that is existing in the community, but also the traditions. So tell us a little bit about what Shabbat looks like for you in your community.
Yeah, so it's a bit difficult to answer this one because I'm, after all, representing such a diverse group. But I think I'll share with you my experience, and which I'm sure many other Sephardim actually would be able to identify with and relate to. So a Shabbat, we hold synagogue services on Friday night, followed by a meal at home. And obviously in non-COVID times, our Shabbat table is always filled with guests, family, friends, students, people who live alone. And Friday and Shabbat meals are very much social events. It's very common, for example, for people from 3 different generations to be sitting together, at the table for hours and chatting and discussing their week, world politics, Israel, anti-Semitism, but also
all of the good things.
Exactly, and also the weekly Torah portion is philosophy, Jewish history. So lots of talking, but lots of singing as well, and it can go till past midnight. And I think the next day we then attend synagogue on Shabbat morning, after which we have a kiddush, which is very important in a Sephardi synagogue, another social occasion, and then we go home for lunch, and then in the afternoon I think we return to synagogue again, between the afternoon and evening prayers, and in between the Seudah Shlishit, which is the 3rd Shabbat meal. So that's how a typical Shabbat would look like.
Interesting. I think it sounds kind of similar to a lot of the Orthodox communities that we've spoken to, but I assume that the songs that you're singing are a little bit different, or maybe kind of sometimes similar. But I'm sure there are tunes that you share that have heritage in the communities that you're part of,
and inspired by the sort of the culture and the music of wherever the community came from. Yeah.
Really, really fascinating. And kosher and also kind of food. I'm kind of, I have Egyptian heritage, and I'm well aware of kind of food and the central part of it in the Egyptian community. Tell us a little bit about the importance of food in your community. Is kind of there an observance of the kashrut laws within the community?
So yeah, I don't need to go into it because we keep the kashrut laws to a sort of an Orthodox standard, but the halacha is slightly different between different Ashkenazi Orthodox communities and the Sephardim, but quite minimal as a whole. And some areas are more lenient and some stricter. But I think it's fair to say that food in general is very important and a serious topic for all Sephardim. It cannot be understated. And the cuisine is, as I said, it's as varied as sort of the countries and communities they come from. So, Moroccan and North African Jews, as you said, like Egyptian, Turkish, Iraqis, Indian, Yemenites, they all have their special dishes and special foods. And you could probably spend a series on that. But I think one thing we probably have in common is actually on the Shabbat table, we serve lots of salads and starters. In my house, we could have up to 10. It's like tapas style. And I think the main course is generally varied. At least in my house, it was on the Shabbat lunch. And on Shabbat day, we have the Sephardi version of cholent. We call it adafina, but some call it dafina or chamin. I'm sure there's other names. And all grandmothers claim to have the secret recipe.
Of course. That sounds really wonderful. And tell us a little bit about tefillah, prayer, and what that looks like. What does a kind of Sephardi prayer space look like? And what would we, if someone hadn't ever come to a Sephardi synagogue, what would that experience be like for them?
So I think we're supposed to pray 3 times a day. There's a lot of emphasis among the Sephardim to chant together, so that would be quite noticeable at first, and including children as well in the services. Inevitably, in the main service as well, and the Sephardi services therefore take a bit longer, as every word is pronounced carefully. There's sometimes the jokes, which is for a Sephardi service, you need a calendar because you don't know how many days it could take. So there's something to that. I think another component which is really unique to Sephardim, and it comes into the prayer as well, are their dialects, at least historically, whether it is Judeo-Spanish or Judeo-Arabic, Haketia, Spanish, there's all different ways of calling it, and I'm not an expert on the differences. But this is obviously another commonality Sephardim shared, and Ladino is the Judeo-Spanish language which is inserted in the prayer. And one well-known example, for instance, in many Sephardi families who had a connection to Spain was the Bendigamos, which is added after the Grace for Meals, the Birkat Hamazon, which is like a short poem thanking God for the food, which is said in Ladino. But yeah, that's more or less what I can say about prayer.
That's really lovely. I love the piece about kind of chanting together. I've experienced that, and I think it's we haven't mentioned that because I think in the other conversations that we've been having, some of the synagogues and kind of communities that we've been speaking to, that's the approach has been to do something, some parts silent, some parts together. Some synagogues have been doing things kind of more singing focused, and it's interesting that everyone reads things together or chants things together in your community. So let's get down to kind of observances and beliefs. Does someone need to observe particular things or believe particular things to be part of your community? I know that you mentioned before that religious people and secular people within your community are together. It's kind of unified in some way. But what does someone need to have any particular beliefs or observances before they're accepted in?
Yeah, so that's very important, sort of what I said earlier, because typically within the same synagogue community and even schools and Sephardi schools, irrespective of their religious level, they'll all attend the same one. And as you said, some will be more observant than others. And this can be a huge range. But yes, there is the expectation, though, is that the rabbi and the religious institutions adhere to the traditional halachic framework as put forth in the Talmud, the Maimonides Mishneh Torah, Rav Karo's Shulchan Aruch. So there is a framework there that's expected. Now, and our Judaism has always been based on an interpretation of and fidelity to the law is sort of the context and is the ideal. So to be Sephardi, though, there aren't really dogmatic beliefs that you must subscribe to be considered a part. It really welcomes everyone and embraces all types and stripes, and that would be very noticeable when you walk into a Sephardi synagogue. But generally speaking, Sephardim keep quite an emotional attachment to Judaism, no matter how distant or involved they are. They tend to be more traditional, and at the same time, it doesn't really matter what they think, do, or wear. They're very much part of the congregation. I think, having said that, historically, on very sort of rare, extreme cases, there have been individuals who have been sort of shunned and kicked out. And I think the most famous one is Baruch Spinoza, right? Who was excommunicated from a Dutch Sephardi community, which was very large at the time. But I think that's sort of beyond the scope of this conversation. There's obviously gray areas, and each community is different with different parameters and different rules that they establish themselves. But yeah, I think that would be sort of a conversation in and of itself.
Completely. And I think there's something about shared history that informs what it looks like to be in community with other Sephardi people. It's not necessarily about beliefs or observances, but kind of a shared history and heritage that brings people together so much of the time. And it's different to kind of a classic denomination. One of the things that is important to me when we have this conversation, I mentioned it right at the beginning, is to talk about stereotypes. Because often people come to these conversations or conversations with people from other denominations and communities with stereotypes. And what I want to ask you is kind of what's the biggest stereotype that people have had about you and your community? And importantly, I ask this to everybody, how does that affect you? Kind of what does it leave you feeling?
I know talking about stereotypes or misconceptions, my father would always answer this by saying, people tend to think all Sephardim are sort of the same, and all of them eat rice on Pesach, for example, and that's simply not true. Like, for example, some of us don't, and we don't eat rice. I mean, it's sort of a joke, but it's serious, but it reflects something else. I think, but one of the most common stereotypes, though, is that I've come across is that Sephardim are often perceived as backwards and superstitious. And I think anyone who is familiar with the history will actually realize that the reality is sort of, the history tells a different story. For example, the more rationalist approach to Judaism, or so much of the intellectualism or openness to science that we see in rabbinic literature, that we see among Jews even today, right, in general, is actually rooted in the classic Sephardic approach to Torah and life. Very often when young Jews leave their bubbles or their families and sort of face reality and the real world, whether it's in university or the workplace, literature, or even like today, the internet, of course, they may encounter things that challenge their faith. And what's astounding to me is that it's in fact the Sephardi rabbis, from medieval times that we turn to for clearing up our perplexities. And I'll give an example. People who deal with these difficult questions, obviously like the late Rabbi Sachs, for example, he would rely on rabbis like Saadia Gaon, Maimonides, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and many of these others who lived in the 10th, 11th, 12th century. And at the end of the day, that's always connected to them. And I'll add, further to that, among the masses in the last few centuries, there's always been pockets of learned and well-educated people, despite living in an environment, you could say, which in general was not conducive to academic study or intellectual pursuit like it was in Europe, where all the universities were, and it was encouraged. And at the same time, these people always existed, and there are entire books on them. So when people say this, it obviously comes from a place of ignorance. And I think what hurts, you're asking how it affects me, it's more when Sephardim are not even aware of themselves, and they sort of buy into that sometimes, and they try to emulate other models. That's where I feel like you have to realize that the reality is far more complex than the stereotype makes it out to be.
100%, and I think that's really important to hear. That what I got from what you were saying is that these stereotypes that Sephardim are backward or kind of superstitious, and that's kind of the experience throughout. Doesn't just affect you from a perspective of kind of that hurts, that's painful, but it also kind of causes internalized stereotypes, thinking about yourself in that way and believing those stereotypes, and hence kind of maybe moving away from your heritage because of that. And that's really, really hard to hear. And I think it's important for people to kind of be aware of that there's huge effects of kind of when we make people out to be all the same in some way, or kind of what we think about based on a stereotype, and affects kind of quite deeply their identity. So one last question for you, Avi, and it's a big one, and I guess it's about the future. And I think one thing that we've kind of definitely made clear throughout this conversation with each other is that Sephardi communities are broad and varied and come from lots of different places with lots of different traditions. But in the UK, there's a kind of somewhat of a kind of constellation of different communities. And let's talk about kind of what are the biggest priorities from your perspective for the Sephardi community in the UK going forward in the next 10 years? What does that look like for you?
I think it's very related to what I was just saying before. Education. I think that's the first point, which is, education is vital, and it sometimes seems to me that the only people who are aware of the Sephardi history and the tradition and the heritage are intellectuals, and the more erudite, and I think it should be part of the curriculum, the general curriculum, mainstream education. What I found quite interesting is that since the pandemic has hit us, many more people have more time, since they're working from home, and thanks to virtual communications and Zoom and there's been actually a resurgence among young and old to get together and learn more about the Sephardi world, culture, and tradition, from everywhere in the world. And I think building on that, which is sort of very related, is institution building. So it's a bit of a more long-term plans, which are building schools, yeshivot, and Sephardic centers, those that will represent the Sephardic tradition and teachings. And this really means getting our act together, being more organized, collaborating, and that's one thing our Ashkenazi brothers and sisters have done really well. And I think that's something that, for example, in their gap year, many Sephardi boys and girls go to Israel or to around the world, and if they tend to become more religious, they sort of sacrifice their own identity and forget their own background. And it really doesn't have to be like that. So, combined with that, it's all about a little bit being more confident in ourselves, which I've actually realized that many of the other denominations, that you've interviewed, they have that. They're sort of, there's a sort of self-awareness. They know, who they are. They're very clear about their own, their own sort of denomination, and they reinforce those principles, and they know what they should stand for. So, I think more recently in the Sephardi community, we've been sort of eclipsed by other communities and traditions, to the point that we've forgotten our own past, and we try to blend in, and this is often reflected, in the manner of dress, speech, school curriculums, and so many other ways. And I think some of it is beyond our control, but a lot of it is our own doing, and can be shaped and rectified. And I think this is an area where it would be great if we can improve in.
It's a really interesting future. And I think that piece about kind of gap years, and people when they become more religious or become more engaged, their only options are to become more engaged with Ashkenazi kind of identity, and leave parts of their identity behind. One question that I kind of got reminded of through hearing you talk about other denominations and kind of how they perceive themselves is kind of perceptions about other denominations. What is something that you kind of admire, in addition to what you just said, I guess, outside of your own community? What's something that you look at another community and say, oh wow, they're doing that particularly well, I'd love to know more about it? And it can be exactly what you just said, but perhaps something else you want to share.
It's a really good and interesting question, I think. I personally participated in the the Chief Rabbi's Ben Azai program, where we traveled to the poorest Muslim regions in northern Ghana, and we learned about extreme poverty and international aid, and it was obviously an eye-opening experience. I've also went to UJS. We went to Ramallah and the West Bank, and where we met Palestinian and exchanged ideas. And it's often that these types of trips are organized by other denominations and communities. They are given a lot of importance there as well. And I personally think Sephardim, like all other Jews, ought to participate in these projects. And historically, I think, Sephardim have been, and like all Jews really, have been in survive mode, right? And rightfully so. Our focus was very inward looking. But I think nowadays, where Sephardi communities thrive, and I think we can learn to broaden our horizons and be more outward looking. And I'm not talking about sort of Sephardi only initiatives, because I don't think that's necessarily has to be so. I think ultimately Sephardim are a minority within a minority, right? So, but I think learning about different cultures, people, and religions is something I found personally quite valuable and admirable, and I think it's something that actually fits into sort of the Sephardi values. It's just one learns to know and more about themselves and understand themselves, I think, and humanity and the world by doing so. So I think that's something which I think individuals and Sephardim could get more involved in.
That sounds like a really wonderful wonderful project that you got involved in, but also a wonderful thought about kind of how the community can kind of look outward, and the caveat that needs to happen when people feel safe, and people aren't in that survive mode, and what it looks like to get people into a space where they feel comfortable to look outward. This has been really fascinating. I'm really glad that you've come along to Denomination to share a little bit about the Sephardi community. There's so much more to learn. And if you're watching tonight, then please, check out the work of what Avi's doing in the Sephardi Chabura and have a look about kind of different Sephardi communities. We'll be hosting an event in June with Sephardi Voices, having grandparents and grandchildren talking to each other about their stories from kind of Morocco and Egypt and Iraq. You please join us for that in the summer. But for now, hope you have a wonderful day, and look forward to seeing you at JW3 events soon.
Thank you, Joe. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. See you all.